All right, you've got the hold on to your carapace. Is everyone with us? Everyone present? No one's having any technological issues? Wonderful. All right, so let's get started then. Here we are. Welcome to Turtle Tales, the life of a Blandings turtle. I'm your host for this evening, Kasia Majewski, and this evening we'll be stepping into the carapace. That's the part of the turtle that most people call the shell, but it's not really a shell, and we'll get to that later on, of one of the local turtle species here in the Carp Barrens. But first, let's have a look at this evening's program. So I am a herpetologist, entomologist, ecologist. I'm originally from Saskatchewan, and I'm a recent transplant here to the Carp Hills area. It looks like most of you were able to make it to the last webinar in this series, so you've heard my introduction before. And of course, I'm thrilled to have all of you here this evening, and it is my absolute pleasure to be representing once again the Friends of Carp Hills as they continue on their mission to protect the beautiful Carp Hills that we call home. In our previous webinars, Janet Mason gave a wonderful talk about the natural history of this area, as she covered everything from the geology of the area and gave an overview to some of the unique species that call this area home as well. Our second webinar and my first webinar was all about plant life, and even included a workshop on how to make some sustainable plant dyes right in your kitchen. And this evening, we're taking a little bit of a different approach. We're moving on up through the different types of organisms that we can find in Carp Hills. And this evening, we're going to be talking about our reptilian residents that reside here, the turtles. What that means is we'll be traveling through time. We'll be looking at different life stages of Blandings turtles. We'll begin with egg laying and move on to life of fragile little hatchlings, to the midlife of these turtles and some of their incredible characteristics, what really makes Blandings turtle a Blandings turtle. And finally, we'll be ending with adulthood and egg laying once again. Should these adults be lucky to reach adulthood, really? So along the road of this journey of the Blandings turtles, we'll be bumping into some of the perils that these incredible animals face, and there are sadly quite a lot of them. It really makes you appreciate what these turtles have to go through just to survive, and really puts into perspective why they're in so much trouble. And if you have any questions at any point during this program, please don't hesitate to ask them. You can ask them in the chat box at any point. We're going to have about a 15-minute question period at the very end of the program. So I won't see your questions until the very end. And we're going to keep everyone muted and cameras off for the duration of this program. But I will get to your questions at the very end, I promise. Also, if this is your first webinar, it's worth knowing that this one is very interactive, a bit like our last one, but even more so. So there's 6 polls that I'm going to be putting up with the help of my behind the scenes tech administrator, Janet Mason, who's helping me this evening. We've got 6 polls for you. Try to answer them as best as you can. It's just for fun. So you can ask a friend, call a lifeline in your house. Try to see if you can work together with the people that might be with you or on your own to answer the questions as quickly as you can. And I want to hear at the very end who got 100%, who was able to answer all of the questions correctly. Now let's start on our journey. And so far I've cheated because the first 2 turtles that you've seen in this presentation, including the one that you're looking at now, it's not a Blandings turtle. So maybe you're not familiar with what the first 2 turtles are at all. And maybe we need to take a closer look at our province in general and see what kind of turtle species are found here, which is our very first poll for the evening. very quickly, how many species of turtles are native to Ontario? This is to wake everyone up and get you thinking about turtles. Choose an answer, any answer. Let's see who knows how many turtles we have in all of Ontario, not just the Carp Hills, but broadly in the province. I've got my answer submitted. Let's see if I'm right. Ooh, do we get an answer popping up? Let's see. Oh, I don't know if we've got an answer popping up. Have you got an answer for us? There we go. There it is. Perfect. Excellent. So the answers all across the board, but the majority of people seem to think that there are 8 species, and you are correct. There are 8 native species of turtles in the Carp Hills. Let's have a look at what they are. So I'm going to put them up one at a time. See if you can guess as I'm putting them up which one is which. Oh, the first one there, and the first one on the PowerPoint presentation is a snapping turtle. Sorry, I don't know why oh, they're gonna come up at once. That's fine. There's the spotted turtle. Let's see who can recognize the next one, which is the northern map turtle. Next one is a Midland painted, and there's actually 2 subspecies of this one. There's the Midland painted and the Western painted turtle. The next one is the Eastern musk turtle, the wood turtle, the Blandings turtle, of course, and the spiny soft shell turtle. Now, I place a lot of emphasis on the native species of turtles because there is one invasive that has so far been found in Ontario, and that is the red-eared sliders. They look like that. They're somewhat similar to some of the species of native turtle that we see here, except you can tell, just as their name suggests, red-eared slider, they have these red marks on the side of their head. They have been introduced to Ontario and parts of North America by people purchasing them as a pet because they're very cute when they're small, and they don't realize that these animals are very long-lived. They can get quite large and they require a lot of care. And they seem to think that releasing them into the wild is the best option for them when they grow older, when in fact that is not a good option at all. They cause a lot of problems in natural habitats around here and cause a lot of competition for other native turtle species. They are just not good news. So we definitely don't want to see any more red-eared sliders. Now, fortunately, there have not been any red-eared sliders that have been reported in the Carp Hills so far, and we're hoping to keep it that way. All right, so we know 8 native species of turtle, 1 invasive. And actually, there's 3 of those species that are found here in Carp Hills, and all 3 of them, plus 1 extra, has been found or are in the promotional video for this webinar. So I don't know if everyone got a chance to see the promotional video for this webinar. I'm going to put it up for you really quickly. And I just want you to watch it. It's very, very quick, so make sure you're paying lots of close attention. There's 4 species of turtle that we just talked about that are in this video. And the next poll is going to be about which 3 are found here in the Carp Hills. Have a look. Oh, hold on, not yet. I'm just going to play the video first, Janet. There we go, thank you. Oh, if it lets me. All right, did you catch those? That was the 4 that were in the video. And now you can enter the poll. So which one of those do you think is not found in the Carp Hills area? There we go. So choose your answer. Which one do you think is not found here? I'm going to make my choice. Oh, hold on. We didn't get a chance to vote on that one. I think we had a technological malfunction. All right, well, you can put your answer in the chat if you wanted to guess which one it was. So if anyone wants to take a guess at which one is not found of these 4 species, you can enter your answer in the chat there. I'll give you 1 minute to do that before we go over the right answers. Remember, you're aiming for 100% right answers. Okay, we've got a couple guesses for northern map. Brilliant. And you're absolutely right. Really, we've got a clever crowd this evening. Excellent. Well, you'll be pleased to know that our poll questions only get a little bit trickier from here. So I'm glad you have your basic turtle knowledge down, but make sure that you keep paying attention for the next few poll questions that we have. Yeah, so the 3 species that are found in the Carp Hills, we've got the Blandings, the snapping, and the Midland painted turtle are found here. And this evening, we're just going to focus on one of those because our program for tonight is only about 45 minutes long. And if you get me talking about more than one species of turtle, you will never, ever leave because I will want to talk your ear off for the rest of the evening. So we're just going to choose the one, the Blandings turtle, and we're going to go on a journey through the eyes of one of these individual turtles, if you can imagine that for the evening. We're going to start off by looking at where these turtles are found exactly. Because when you start looking at range maps for these animals, you realize how fortunate we are actually to be living so close to a population of them here. Their range isn't very large. You can see it there across North America. That blue bit there is where Blandings turtles have been found. So relatively, that's not a lot of room, particularly when you start looking at their range just here in Canada. They're sort of just in the southern part of Ontario, branching a little bit into Quebec, with some really interesting, very small populations found in Nova Scotia. But something I want to stress here is that these maps often look a bit more optimistic than what the reality is. So they're a little bit misleading. If you look really closely at these maps, it sort of looks like that range covers the entire part of southern Ontario, like these turtles are everywhere in there. But the reality is when you start looking at populations of them, there's very few sort of scattered wetlands where they have been identified. And this map actually shows 2 different kinds of populations, ones that have been cited post 1983 and ones that have been cited pre 1984. So really what we're looking at here is a lot of populations that haven't been seen for about, well, nearly 40 years, I suppose. So we're really lucky to be living right next to wetlands that support an active population of these species, because there really isn't very many areas that can do that, and there isn't a lot of them left. All right, so imagine that we're traveling into the Carp Barrens, the area of the Carp Hills that supports Blandings turtle life. And you can imagine now, a bit easier than during my first webinar, that it is spring, maybe a little bit later in the spring than now, but not much later, especially if we continue with warm weather like this. This is about the time that Blandings turtles start getting really interested in egg laying. So if you can start to kind of imagine a female Blandings turtle who is now looking for maybe a mate, probably a few mates. Usually females breed with several males over the course of the season. And that in itself is a little bit tricky. So turtles can travel quite far distances. I'll talk about that a little bit later, to find each other. And then once they do breed, females have to find a place to lay their eggs. And they're very, very fussy about that. And I want you to imagine that you are a Blandings turtle, a female Blandings turtle, and you know that you need to find a spot for laying your eggs. And I want you to imagine what that spot looks like. And I want you to tell me about it in this next poll, because we've got sort of 5 different options here. Which of these looks like a suitable nesting site to a Blandings turtle? So you can make your vote if you can imagine you're a turtle looking for a place to lay your eggs. Where would you go? Where looks suitable to you? All right. Okay, I'm going to make my selection here. Okay. Hopefully you've had a little discussion or you've had a little think about where looks best. Okay, so we've had a couple people guess the side of a wetland, which makes a lot of sense, and some people a little bit away from a wetland. And then the majority of you have chosen all of the above, and that is absolutely the correct answer. All of these sites appear to be suitable as a nesting site from the ground level. If you're a Blandings turtle looking for a spot to lay your eggs, you want to find soil that's easy to dig a hole in, easy to make a nest in. So something sort of sandy, gravelly. You don't want areas with a lot of vegetation because that's difficult for you to make your nest in. And also there could be potential predators there. So you're really looking for kind of this more open, kind of gravelly, sandy area. And a lot of lakesides and a lot of wetlands, the edges of wetlands, have that kind of, these sorts of areas. Interestingly, there have also been nests found further away from wetlands, possibly, areas that maybe aren't as flooded or they're just more suitable for some reason. But you can imagine as well that trails, particularly ones that have been created by humans, they're often sort of dug up and then packed down with this sandy, gravelly soil. And roadsides, particularly as well. I mean, to a Blandings turtle, that picture on the top right just looks like, the perfect sort of edge of a wetland or of a lakeside. Really easy to dig into, nice and warm, no predators around, kind of a good vantage point to spot any predators. It looks like there's a lot of, good things about that spot. And unfortunately, that's a lot of what we're seeing is, this sort of first big peril that these Blandings turtles have to face, which is roadside accidents. And a lot of adult turtles and a lot of hatchling turtles get run over each year because of this situation that we have inadvertently created this perfect habitat for turtles to lay their eggs in. Or alternatively, because they're moving around and trying to find mates as well, they often have to cross roadways. Sorry. So this is our first big peril. And you might be wondering, how exactly is it that something that looks like it's wearing, a suit of armor, how is it possible that this animal is so susceptible to being crushed by vehicles? Surely it looks, indestructible. But something I think a lot of people don't really realize when they think about turtles, and I think particularly because we refer to the back of a turtle as its shell, is we kind of think that a turtle's shell is separate to its body. It's like a snail shell. It's this hardened piece that the turtle itself is hiding inside of. But actually, that's not at all the case. In truth, a turtle's shell is the turtle. It's actually a modified spine. You can see in the picture there. So it's got its spinal column on the back there. And that forms what we call the carapace, that word that you've already heard earlier on in the presentation. And they still have nerve endings all along the back of their spine. So turtles still have feeling across their carapace. So while that carapace has been designed to shield them from predators, it absolutely cannot withstand really traumatic impacts from things like vehicles. It will crush them, just like we would be crushed if something drove over our spine. It's a really sort of dreadful way to perish. So certainly be careful at places where there are turtles crossing signs. Even if there are turtle fences, just be wary of turtles crossing the road, particularly in spring and autumn when they're the most active, because there's no competition. They're not going to be able to handle an impact from a vehicle. And this is why their anatomy is why. So that's the first big peril. Make sure that you remember that. All right, so luckily, our female that we've been following along, who's ready to lay her eggs, she's found an excellent spot to lay her eggs. And we can pretend that this YouTube video I found here, which hopefully shows up on your screen as well. Oh. Goes there. So this is a remarkable video that I found. It was taken by a conservation group, which is why they were able to get so close to this turtle. I, of course, can't emphasize enough that you should not look for turtles laying eggs, and you certainly should not shine a light on them or try to film them. It can disrupt them. This was clearly a herpetology-based conservation group just trying to capture this magical moment. And we can pretend that this is our female Blanding turtle that we've started off with, who's found her mates, and she's making her nest. So all of those eggs that she's laid there, collectively, that's what's called a clutch. So far we've got a carapace, which is what most people know as the shell of the turtle, and we've got the clutch, which is the collection of eggs that turtles lay in the nest. So once she's laid her eggs and she's happy with that, she'll actually just go off on her merry way. She's probably very tired because female turtles can take up to 7 days to find an appropriate nesting site. And then they can travel over 7 kilometers in their search. They've been tracked traveling over 7 kilometers total in their search for looking for these suitable nesting sites. So once she's done all of that and dug her nest, which can also take over 2 hours for her to get a nest that size, she's probably had just about enough of this whole situation, and she wanders off on her merry way. And she doesn't have a lot to worry about because she knows that what she's left behind her is some brilliant security. So a lot of people think that reptiles they're not very paternal or maternal. They don't care for their young. And that is not true in every case. And certainly with Blandings turtles, something amazing that we see is that males will hang around the female after she's created her nest, and then they will actually stand and guard the nest until the hatchlings emerge. And they'll try their best to kind of scare away, spook off any predators. They're not very big turtles and they're not very aggressive turtles, so they're not always successful in what they try to do, but I do think it's remarkable that they do attempt this nest guarding behavior. And they can do that for sort of the 3 or up to 4 months for the eggs that takes for the eggs to develop. It takes longer the further sort of north you go, the northern parts of their range, it can take longer for the eggs to develop, and further south into the States, it takes less time for the eggs to develop. So our female has chosen a great spot. She's left her eggs behind. They're being guarded by males, thankfully. And we're very, very lucky because our particular nest for the evening has survived to this point, and we are able to see some hatchlings. So prepare yourself for the absolute marvel that is tiny hatchling turtles. and there will only be a few of them. So some turtles, you might be familiar with green sea turtles, for example, that can lay up to 60 eggs in a clutch. And we've all seen those videos of those little sea turtles trying to make their way down a beach. While a Blandings turtle will only lay on average about 10 eggs. And then on average, about 8 of those eggs will successfully hatch and produce offspring. Older females will have potentially larger clutches, and they'll have a higher survival rate because they get a little bit better at building nests and finding appropriate nest sites. So this is it. This is our tiny little Blandings turtle that we're going to follow for the rest of this evening. If you'd like to give her a name, Bella has been suggested. So this can be Bella, the Blandings turtle. If it helps you follow her on her journey to give her a name, I absolutely welcome that for this evening. She's going to spend the next year growing rapidly. They grow really, really quickly. And within the first year, she's already going to start developing and changing a bit. So her shell, her carapace will flatten out a bit. And the under part of the turtle, the hardened belly of a turtle, that has a special name as well. That's called a plastron. And when little tiny hatchling turtles are first born, their carapace and their plastron, that protective armor that they wear, is not very hard yet. It has to harden with time. And it starts to do that in their first year of life. Their big mission, and our Bella's big mission for her first year, is going to be eating as much as she can as she grows. Blandings turtles in general are called omnivores. Some of you have probably heard that term before. Omnivores means that they eat both meat and plants. Although hatchlings, our little tiny Bella, little tiny hatchling turtles eat many more plants than they do meat sources. Adults will eat more sort of meat sources. And their diet is mostly things like crayfish or aquatic insects like aquatic larvae like dragonflies, aquatic beetles, fish or frogs, or fish and frog eggs. They'll eat those as well. And for plants, they typically eat sort of duckweed, or they can eat sedges and bulrushes. So our little Bella is spending her first year of life consuming as much as she can. But she's doing that from the safety and the comfort of the shoreline of her wetlands. And, you know, Bella is very lucky in this presentation. Our turtle is very lucky because her habitat, it's in the Carp Barrens. And the Carp Barrens has a lot of people that care very much about it and try very hard not to leave behind any pollution or any plastic. Because one of the big problems that's coming up now, the second peril that Blandings turtles face is plastic pollution on the edges of wetlands. So this kind of plastic pollution can really hinder little turtles who are just trying to find things to eat. They can end up swallowing bits of plastic, or different kinds of pollution can also prevent their types of food, their preferred food, from growing or being present where they are. So certainly a second peril is plastic pollution, and that's becoming more of a problem the world over, and something that we need to be really vigilant about here in the Carp Hills, so that we can maintain a healthy habitat for our Blandings turtles. So that's our second peril of the evening. But as I mentioned, Bella's very fortunate and she continues to grow. So we've zoomed now from a spring where we had egg laying to an autumn where we had eggs hatching. And now we've moved ahead 2 to 3 years. And Bella and turtles, Blandings turtles around this age, are starting to undergo some pretty cool changes. This plastron that I mentioned earlier, this bottom bit of the protective outer body of this turtle is developing this hinge that you can see in the picture in the background. And what that serves to do is actually close like a door from the bottom. You can see there's a little Blandings turtle there, and the plastron is sort of partially shut. And the older they get, the more that plastron develops. And by the time that they're fully grown, they can actually shut themselves entirely inside their carapace and plastron. And they're basically just this hardened sort of football. And that takes a bit of time for them to develop that. So until they develop this hardened outer coating, they're quite susceptible still to predators. And we'll talk about that in a moment. So that development of that hinge takes about 2 to 3 years. By about 4 years old, our little hatchling baby turtles, including Bella, are about nearly sort of adult size, but it still takes till they're about sort of 5 years old before they can fully shut themselves inside of their carapace and their plastron there. So at this stage, you might be thinking that 5 years old for a turtle, that's pretty good. I mean, they're not very big turtles. The adults range from about 150 millimeters to 240 millimeters in length, and they only weigh about 750 to 1400 grams. So they're not very large. They're what's referred to as sort of a medium-sized turtle. And so you might be thinking that for an animal this size, 5 years seems, you know, pretty good, pretty up there. However, 5 years old for a Blandings turtle is actually very, very young. Blandings turtles have about the same life expectancy as human beings. In the wild, they can live for sort of between 70 to 77 years. The oldest Blandings turtle that has been found was actually 83 years old. And there's a lot of research that suggests that it's quite possible, and in fact likely, that there have been Blandings turtles that have lived to be over 100 years old. So they're a very, very long-lived species. So 5 years is still a juvenile. That's still a very young turtle. How do you know how old a Blandings turtle is? Well, just like when you cut open a tree and you can count the tree rings to give you an idea of how old a tree is, the outside of a turtle on the shell, you can count the rings on a turtle shell, and these are called annuli. That's another sort of specialized word that has to do with turtles, and that can give us an idea of how old a turtle is. So that's how herpetologists were able to age these turtles. All these interesting things about turtles, and you might be wondering, okay, so they can hide in their shells, you know, they can hunt for all kinds of things underwater. They're pretty good at hiding from predators, or at least ours has been so far. But what about communication with other turtles? Is that possible? Can they talk to one another? And that's quite a profound question. And the truth is that we don't know a lot about that. There has been some interesting research that we've learned. Some herpetologists have recorded sounds that these turtles have been making underwater that they believe to be communication. And while we don't know what they mean, what their signaling means between other species of Blandings or other individuals of Blandings turtles, there was actually a really interesting study done about South American freshwater turtles, another species of turtle that was also sort of vocalizing, making sounds underwater. And they have found that that's a form of communication between different turtle species. So that's one of the ways that we think that they can communicate with one another. So a very long-lived turtle, it has some amazing adaptations, and it can communicate with others of its kind as well. So life is going pretty well for our young Blandings turtle so far out on the Barrens, but as I've hinted at a little bit so far to this point, she always has to be mindful, and all Blandings turtles always have to be mindful because they're pretty bright, bite-sized for a lot of other species out in the Carp Barrens. They do have a lot of predators. Oh, I didn't change the slide. The question should be, what is the most recent, or what is the most recent predator for Blandings turtles? Not necessarily the most dangerous. What is an emerging predator for Blandings turtles? So we know that they have lots of different kinds of predators that are dangerous to them, but what is one that is emerging, that we're finding to be a new kind of predator for Blandings turtles that we are concerned about? So have a little think about that question. See if you can figure out which one it is. Some difficult choices to make there. See if you can figure it out. Excellent. I'm going to make my answer here. I'm hoping you can't see what answers I'm making. You're not cheating. All right, let's see what you think the most recent, emerging predator. Yeah, so most of you said domestic cats and dogs, or raccoons and foxes. And actually, so you're not far off. So predation from wildlife has always been an issue for Blandings turtles. They've co-evolved with a lot of their predators, and that's why they have some of these unique behaviors and these unique characteristics that they look for example, in their nesting sites. You know, they're trying their best to evade these predators. And they've done a fairly good job until this point in co-evolving with them because they've managed to exist until this point. The problem is that predators are obviously always going to continue to be a problem. And now we have the added pressures, the added problems, both from what some people call subsidized predators. And these are predators that are naturally occurring, but are also attracted to humans. So foxes and raccoons, for example, really like hanging around humans. They like our garbage. They think we're good fun. So typically where you have areas where you have humans, so villages or sort of developing housing developments, for example, where you might find more garbage to get into, you'll find a greater volume of raccoons and foxes. And that greater volume of raccoons and foxes means that there's also more predators for these turtles to worry about, a higher volume for them to worry about. So that, of course, is an issue. And then what I wanted to really draw attention to with this peril is this emerging concern as well about domestic animals like cats and dogs that have been found to hunt turtles as well. And there's actually been a couple studies done so far on dogs digging up turtle nests in the States. Here in Carp Hills and on the Carp Barrens, it's not clear to us always who is the culprit when it comes to turtle deaths. However, this very powerful photo that you're looking at right now, that's actually a deceased Blandings turtle. You can see part of the carapace there and part of the body. And what's interesting about this picture is that this turtle was not eaten. So whatever caused it to die whoever or whatever caused it was not intending to eat it. And that suggests either human or domestic pet activity. There's more and more information available as well about how outdoor cats are causing bird and reptile and amphibian local extinctions as well. So all of these things together, the natural predators, the predators that are increasing because of human activities, and the predators that humans are themselves introducing to the environment. All of these things are certainly a danger, a peril to our Blandings turtles. I'm happy to say that our turtle, Bella, continues to live her life happily for the purposes of this webinar. She has not been impacted by a predator. And in fact, if we fast forward through her life, if we look into our turtle crystal ball 20 years from now into the future, Bella is still thriving. She's doing great. And in fact, she is preparing to lay eggs of her own. So Blandings turtles, being very long-lived, remember they have a lifespan of about 70 years, only reach reproductive maturity at about 18 to 25 years of age. And after that, it still takes females to be get better, get improved at building nests and having more successful clutches. So older females are invaluable to an ecosystem, to a population of Blandings turtles. So we're back sort of at the start of our cycle. Bella is going to be laying some eggs, except it looks like we've gone 20 years into the future, but into the winter. We haven't hit spring. And the Carp Barrens, well, they look pretty frozen. Some might say they look exactly how they also looked about a month ago, which is actually when this picture was taken. But it begs the question, how are these turtles surviving through the cold climate that we have here? They extend down into the southern parts of the range, into the states where actually you don't have winters like this. And so they remain active year round, but they're found here in the Carp Hills and the Carp Barrens where we can have really cold winter temperatures. So what are turtles doing? How are they overwintering? Well, we know that they hibernate. And actually, there's a very cool picture. I don't know how many of you saw it. It was in the news this past week. And as soon as I saw it, I knew I would have to include it into this webinar. Look at this. So this is not a Blandings turtle. I was unable to find a picture of a hibernating Blandings turtle. This is a hibernating snapping turtle, and a really big one at that. But it just really puts into perspective how turtles spend their winters, how they hibernate. Blandings turtles will do the same thing. They will overwinter either underwater, or a lot of turtle species, Blandings turtles included, will dig into the sides of riverbanks and they'll hibernate in the mud. So that looks like quite a harsh way to spend several months out of the year. And it certainly begs the question, how are these turtles breathing when they hibernate like this? How is it possible? So that brings us to our next poll. I want to know if you know, how do turtles breathe when they hibernate? And your choices are through their noses, through their mouths, through tiny snorkels, through their butts, or through their skin. So definitely vote now. And I should mention that we only sort of recently, this information sort of recently came to light, because previously it was believed that turtles survive through anaerobic respiration, meaning they didn't breathe in a conventional way. And it was quite a complicated process. And it was only recently that we realized that they are actually breathing through an entirely different method altogether. Let's see what you thought it was. Do they build tiny snorkels? Haha! So the majority of you thought through their skin. And it's not a bad guess, because there are, the sort of cousins of reptiles, amphibians, another group of animals that we call, quote, cold-blooded, unquote, they can breathe through their skin, certainly. So you kind of think water, something cold-blooded, it can breathe through its skin. Turtles, of course, they're not amphibians, so they can't breathe through their skin exactly. In fact, they do practice something which has been affectionately called butt breathing. So the answer is through their butts. Or if you want to give it a proper name, it's called cloacal respiration. What cloacal respiration is, so we've covered some parts of the turtle so far. Going over them quickly again, we have the carapace, we have the plastron, and now the cloaca it's the turtle's vent. So it's where they release their waste from, and it's also where they lay their eggs from. And inside their cloaca, they also have these special sacs called bursa. And these bursa are lined with tons and tons of blood vessels. And they have a very, very thin membrane between those blood vessels and the water that the turtle is surrounded by as it's hibernating, or the environment it's surrounded by as it's hibernating. So basically what starts happening is carbon dioxide from the turtle's body travels from the body into these bursa around the cloaca, and it's diffused. It moves out of the turtle's body into the environment, into the water. And then water is absorbed through the membrane, oxygen from the water is absorbed through the membrane into the bursa and into the turtle's body. And that's exactly what breathing is. When we inhale and exhale, we are exhaling excess carbon dioxide and we're inhaling oxygen. So that's what the turtle is doing through these bursa, essentially butt breathing. So if there's one fact that you take away from this evening, this might be a good one. Who am I to say which is the best fact? But this is certainly one of my favorites. So now our Bella has survived 20 some years. She has finished hibernating, and it's time for her to lay eggs. And if it's not her first time laying eggs, she will return to roughly the same spot where she laid them before. Blandings turtles typically return to the same nesting sites year after year. But what happens if that nesting site has disappeared? Well, that sort of brings us to the fourth peril that these turtles encounter, which is habitat destruction. And a whole host of problems can arise from destroying turtle habitat, not least of which is the removal of really valuable nesting sites, which can push them to sort of nest in areas that are not suitable. So roadsides or trails, for example, which of course is a problem like we saw in the first peril that these turtles face. Or it can become much more stressful. So if you can imagine Bella, if she returns to the nesting site that she knows and loves, only to realize that it no longer exists and she's not able to lay her eggs there, she might have to travel another few days, another few kilometers, which for a turtle is immense, trying to find a spot to lay her eggs. Reptiles, if they're unable to find a place to lay their developed eggs, can also become something called egg bound, where essentially the eggs go bad inside their bodies, and they very often don't survive. So they need an appropriate depository to lay their eggs. So certainly habitat destruction is a big problem. And something I really want to stress is often when we think of habitat destruction, we think of something like what is pictured here, again, something really big, really profound, a housing development or road coming through, but it's not always so obvious. It can be much more subtle. It can be, you know, an unauthorized trail going through prime, valuable turtle nesting sites. You know, just even smaller things. So it's important, I think, to keep that in mind. There's another more subtle, but also, well, at the moment it's subtle. It's a relative term, but it's a globally relevant type of habitat destruction that's happening all around us already, and that's our fifth and final peril, which is climate change. And so you can't talk about habitat destruction and endangered species without talking about climate change, because it's already causing problems across the world, and they will continue to get worse if we continue on the trajectory that we're on. Specifically for Blandings turtles, you know, it changes the composition of wetlands. It can cause all sorts of problems that we may not yet foresee for these particular species. We don't know what's ultimately going to happen with Blandings turtles. It's possible that maybe they're one of the species that rapidly adapt to these changes in our atmosphere and in the world, but because they're so long-lived and they have such small clutches, it's unlikely. So that's already a problem for them. Something else that's very interesting that I like to just briefly mention about Blandings turtles is they exhibit something called temperature sex determination in their eggs. And basically what that means is Blandings turtles' eggs will develop into male or female depending on the temperature. Specifically, if it's a lower temperature, the eggs will develop into male turtles. And if it's a higher temperature, the eggs will develop into females. Now you can imagine global warming. Herpetologists are concerned that for species like the Blandings turtle that exhibit this temperature sex determination, that could mean that we start seeing a lot more female turtles, maybe too many female turtles, and that can cause a lot of problems. So far, the studies that I've read are mostly occurring in green sea turtles, and we haven't seen any indication that there are a significantly a greater amount of female turtles hatching. But who's to say what the future holds? This is certainly, I think, a concern that some herpetologists have. So that is our final peril. And if you're sort of sitting there now thinking that's a lot of perils, that's a lot of problems that this really lovely, this really marvelous species of turtle is up against. If you're feeling a little bit sad, if you're feeling a little bit heavy, then you're absolutely right, because it's a lot that these animals are up against. But there are things that you can do to help. There are things that you can do to make a difference, and quite rapidly, actually, because once again, we share a habitat with these Blandings turtles. So our actions matter directly to these animals. Here are just some of the ways that you can help the turtles beat the odds and help little turtles like Bella continue to survive and thrive in our beautiful Carp Barrens. The reality is that so many of the perils that we've talked about this evening are human driven. So if you can find ways to help contribute to protecting these turtles rather than contributing to the perils that they face, you're already doing a wonderful job of helping these animals survive. Which is wonderful, because obviously we feel, I'm sure I'm preaching to the converted. We live in such a beautiful place, and it's amazing that we get to share it with so many species. So it's important that we care for them. Here, single-handedly, or singularly, the most helpful thing you can do, because we have an organization like Friends of Carp Hills, who have very carefully begun to study the Blandings turtle population that we have in the Carp Barrens. They've already laid out a very good set of instructions about what we can do as a community, how we can work together to save these turtles. And they've put them, all these instructions, quite obviously, on trail signs around the area. So if you're wondering what you can do to help protect these turtles, look no further than some of the signage kindly provided by Friends of Carp Hills. And some of those signs outline things like where pets like dogs are or are not allowed. And you can hopefully imagine now by the end of this webinar why it's so critically important that dogs are not permitted, and they are not permitted on the Carp Barrens. I'm a dog owner myself, but I'm also absolutely a turtle lover. And to me, it's no contest. I can love and prevent both from experiencing any kind of perils or harms. I just walk my dog somewhere else. Also, make sure that if you see any of these turtles, you can appreciate them from a distance. So definitely be on the lookout for them, but just remember that they just need a bit of our space and they need respect from us as well. And finally, tell everyone you know about these turtles, and share any interesting facts you might have learned tonight. The biggest ally for these turtles is word of mouth from us humans, encouraging people to care, encouraging people towards stewardship. If you think they're really neat, which hopefully after this evening I've convinced you that they are completely unique and marvelous, then share that with the people that you know so that we can all be very excited to be living alongside this species all together. And it is worth mentioning here as well, something else that Friends of Carp Hills is also sharing with the community. We have been enjoying some beautiful weather, and make sure you go out and enjoy it. But keep in mind that the Carp Barrens Trail, for the protection of the turtles and a lot of the other species that are found there, that trail is closed from the first Tuesday after Victoria Day in May until August 15th. And it's precisely for some of the reasons that we discussed in this webinar, just to give these turtles a bit of peace and quiet while they try to go up against the odds and create their nests and continue on. So brilliant. So those are some of the things that you can do. We're going to end off with one last poll. I'm going to see who's really been paying attention this evening. Hopefully all of you. I've tried my best to keep it interesting. And that poll is, which of these was a peril presented in this webinar? You can choose more than one as you like. So can you identify a peril or the perils, all of them that were present in this webinar? So make your choices now. Our final poll for the evening, your last chance to make it to 100%. Give everyone a moment to read them over. Okay. All right. Okay, for the most part, there was a couple of you that forgot about climate change and vehicular traffic. Traffic was the first peril that we talked about, turtles getting run over on roadways. Whew, losing all my words this evening. And climate change was that very last peril that we discussed. which is a looming threat to a lot of our diversity. But otherwise, brilliant. That's perfect. Wonderful. So thank you very much. Before I take questions, I'm just very quickly going to remind everyone that our next webinar is on April 22nd at 6:30 in the evening. It's all about myths, legends, and the biology of the nocturnal whippoorwills out on the Carp Barrens. So don't hesitate to come and join us. It's going to be a very interesting evening. If you want to hear more about what goes bump in the night on the Carp Barrens, that's the webinar for you. I'll be hosting that one as well, and I hope to see you there. All right, I'm going to turn it over. I'm going to stop my screen sharing, and I'm going to turn on just my camera and everyone else to keep their cameras off, but I'm going to turn mine on just so it gives you. So let's see if I can do that. Okay, here I am. I'm the disembodied voice that you've been hearing all evening. Lovely to see you all again. And I'm going to look at the chat here and see if there are any questions that I can answer that anyone might have had. I went so over time on my first webinar. This is probably the shortest I've ever spent talking about turtles. So I'm delighted to see I'm not keeping you all evening, but I'm very, very happy to answer any questions that you might have. Let's see if there's any I missed. I will just give it just a moment. Excellent. Oh, excellent. Wonderful. Janet's written a lovely comment. For those who live in the Carp Hills, they can protect a nest if they find one. So that's very good to know. Excellent. All right. How do you protect a nest? From Ian Richardson. I'll see if Janet, if you'd like to answer that one. I would imagine it involves some protective wiring or creating an obstacle from predators. Janet, would you like to explain a bit more about that? Oh, interesting. All right, we'll see. Maybe Janet will answer a little bit more about protecting nests in a moment. Someone else has asked a very interesting question. Has anyone ever sequenced the DNA of the Blandings turtle in the Carp Hills to compare it to other Blandings in other areas? Mike, I haven't the foggiest. I don't know if they have. That would be very, very interesting. I genuinely don't know. That would be worth looking into. I wonder if you're wondering if there's different subspecies, because very often when you have a singular species that has a wide range like that and they have different behaviors, you might start to see candidates for subspecies if you start looking at their DNA or start looking further at their behavior. As I was reading about this species, I was actually really surprised and somewhat dismayed, sometimes excited about how little we know about Blandings turtles, particularly in Canada. A lot of the research seems to be done in the States, at least what I have found. So that's a very interesting question. Is there an estimate of how many Blandings turtles there are? Allison, that's a wonderful question. And actually something I was really hoping someone would ask. First of all, I didn't find a concrete number. Second of all, it wouldn't matter. And here's why. I personally belong to the school of ecologists who make the argument for sort of producing population numbers of animals as proof for why they might be threatened or endangered as not a strong measure or not a strong argument. What I mean by that is If you think about it, who should decide how many turtles there should be? So is there a threshold that we should sort of look at that decides which species are endangered and which aren't? If there's 42 turtles left, does that make them endangered? But if there's 43, then it doesn't. Things can get a bit sticky if you start relying on numbers. I suspect, and I was kind of trying to look at a ballpark, and I didn't really find a lot of information. And I suspect that that is because, like with a lot of other cryptic reptile and amphibian species, it's very difficult to do species counts and to know how many there are. What's the most important for this species is we know that their populations are decreasing, just sort of based on local counts, not total counts. And we know that they're decreasing as well because we know their habitats are declining. So for example, you saw in that map, that first map where you saw how many turtles were seen post 1983 and how many were seen pre. Perhaps there's an overall trend in seeing that some of these places that where we used to see Blandings turtles, we don't see them so much anymore. So that gives us an indication of the fact that they're declining. Why it's important to know why species are declining on the decline, why that's more important than just sort of numbers and in general. There's actually a really good explanation about that. If you want to read more about diversity and fluctuations in diversity and how do we know when we're in trouble, Edward Wilson, E.O. Wilson, covers that really extensively in his book, The Diversity of Life. Excuse me. So that would be a really good resource to look at if you want to learn more about sort of how ecologists or biologists decide that a species is endangered and why it matters if species diversity is shrinking, regardless of how many numbers of individuals there are. I hope that makes sense. Can you buy Blandings turtles to release? Is a question from John. So very disappointingly, in the States, while I was Googling about Blandings turtles, I did observe that there's a number of places that sell Blandings turtles as pets. So I imagine in Canada that's wildly illegal because they are a protected species here. And they are protected throughout most of their range. I don't know how it's possible for some Blandings turtles to end up in the pet trade. So that was very disappointing to see. If you ever stumble upon Blandings turtles that you can buy, do not buy them. Definitely report them. And also never release an animal from the pet trade into the wild, even if it is a native in your area. You don't know where these Blandings turtles have been previously. You don't know what kinds of bacteria or pathogens they might be harboring. So you might actually be releasing a typhoid Mary into an environment, being well-meaning and trying to reintroduce a species that is already present there. It's not how it works. So I have 4 years of experience in exotic animal husbandry. I have 5 years of experience in exotic animal husbandry. And one of the places that I worked previously was the Vancouver Aquarium. And the Vancouver Aquarium was trying to get permission to breed frogs in captivity to release them. And part of the requirement was that anyone who went into the separate room where these frogs were held essentially had to wear a hazmat suit. And all of their food was very carefully regulated. The steps that you have to go through to ensure that you're not introducing anything problematic into that population before it's released into the wild are extensive. It's not simply a matter of just transplanting one animal from one area to another. So sadly, that's not an option. It's not that simple. But great question. Thank you for asking that. Okay. That was the intent of the question. Brilliant. Oh, I'm glad I could answer that, Mike. That's excellent. Yeah. Yeah. Another question. There was a detailed Blandings turtle population study in South March Highlands. Ah, great. That's excellent. Thank you, Janet. There are 200 here. All right. But that's excellent. Brilliant. Thank you, Janet. Yeah. Great. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, John, so if you're interested in that sort of work, so sort of as Janet mentioned, there are facilities and there are conservation groups that do that sort of thing. So maybe I misunderstood your question. But I think it's what I just want to stress here is it's very important to know the origins of any animal that's being re-released into the wild. That's part of one of the issues of trying to sort of rescue animals from the pet trade if their background is unknown. And that's ultimately what a lot of these conservation groups are doing that are trying to re-release animals into the wild, is they're trying to sort of have a track of the lineage and control as many factors as they can with that population to ensure they're not releasing anything problematic into the environment when they eventually do that. Brilliant. Excellent. These are wonderful questions. That's great. Yeah, I think Janet there really sort of underscores. So she mentioned that in the South March Highland population, by when they were trying to produce or create a development there, they counted 200 turtles. And I want you to think about that. Is 200 turtles enough in an area? You know, it's very much like how long is a piece of string when you start looking at numbers of animals to conserve. I think trends in populations tell us much more about how populations of animals are doing rather than just, you know, singular kind of surveys and singular numbers. Yeah, that's brilliant. Okay, any other questions from anyone this evening? These are brilliant. Oh, brilliant. Mike, that's awesome. Okay. Excellent. All right. Well, it sounds like everyone's questions have been addressed. It has been such a pleasure. Thank you, Janet, so much. Janet has posted a link to the Kaizel wetland population. That's brilliant.
The Kaizel wetland.
Oh, sorry, go on.
It's I realize that you're new to the area, so some of this you wouldn't know about, but about 10 years ago, because an area next to South March Highlands was being developed, they had to do a Blandings turtle population study. They even put little transmitters on these turtles, and they were shocked to find that it were 200, and it was a critical habitat for these, but the development still went ahead. And the developers had to do all sorts of compensation. I don't know how you compensate for destroying 200 turtles. But anyway, there is this study and it's available online. There's the link if people want to take a look at it. And the only other thing I would say, going back to the DNA, as you said, Kasia, the turtles can walk a long way. They can walk over a kilometer. There is evidence that the Carp Hills population does exchange with the South March Highlands population, and that the Carp River is a corridor as well for Blandings turtles to migrate along, excuse me, between parts of the Canada area, South March Highlands, and then the Carp Hills. So there is perhaps some exchange there, but doing a DNA study would be great.
That'd be brilliant and be fascinating. It'd be really, really interesting. Yeah, I know there actually, That reminds me, I think the only DNA studies I've looked at, and probably the most extensively researched population of Blandings turtles in Canada, are the two outlier populations that are in Nova Scotia, because it's really bizarre that they're there. There's just two small populations that they found. So I know that those have been looked at a lot more closely. And I bet you someone's trying to make the argument that they're a subspecies as well, have ended up there. But as far as Ontario populations, and certainly populations around here in the Carp Hills, I didn't see very much about that. So that would be really brilliant. That's excellent. And thank you so much, Janet, for that information about the Kaizel development. That's very interesting. Brilliant. All right. So thank you everyone again so much for coming. This is probably the best way I could have imagined spending my evening talking about turtles with a bunch of other turtle enthusiasts. Thank you for your questions. If you think of any more questions or comments that you have about the webinars, including any other kinds of webinars or any other sort of public engagement topics that you would like to see from Friends of Carp Hills, you can certainly email Friends of Carp Hills, or you can reach Janet through Facebook. I'm always happy to take questions as well. So definitely let us know. And I hope I see all of you back for the next webinar next month on the 22nd about whippoorwills. That's going to be a good one as well. I'm very biased, but I think it's going to be a blast.